With Travis Kelce playing at the Super Bowl, you got to start to think about tight ends and what they mean to the future of fantasy football. And there's no better time to start doing that than looking at the 2023 NFL Draft rookies. So far, we've previewed the QBs, the running backs, the wide receivers, and this position, tight end, I thought was going to be the least interesting of them all. Turns out, actually might be some interesting guys to look at for fantasy football, for real football, guys who could be game-changing players. So I'm pulling up my sheet here, of course, pulling all the info as I have every week for Sports Info Solutions. So shout out to them for giving me that access. And also definitely worth checking out. Again, a little bit of pricey cost for their Data Hub Pro, but if you want to see all this data, I'm looking at the EPA numbers, all the splits, all the filtering, all of that. That's where I'm pulling all this from, and I would give them the biggest cosign I possibly can here. I do want to talk about tight ends because, frankly, I'm blown away by this tight end class. And it's something where last year we didn't really get spoiled by rookie tight ends coming in. Certainly the guys, Daniel Bellinger, Trey McBride, the ones that probably stood out the most. Second-year tight end Kyle Pitts didn't look that great relative to what we all hoped for him after a rookie year that seemed like he was going to smash all the records moving forward. But this year, though, feels like there's a lot of guys you can point to. If you watch the highlights of some of these guys, Michael Mayer, Darnell Washington, Dalton Kincaid, they all look like stars. And I think it's kind of interesting to see that sometimes I talk about you watch the highlight tape, you sometimes get kind of roped into these guys that actually aren't that good. For the case of what we're talking about today, these tight ends that we're going to hit on, I think these guys all look fantastic, both in the advanced analytics as well as the tape. So let's talk about it here. Of course, we'll show you guys the draft board that I'm looking at. This is CBS's mock draft, so I just pull these guys in so I know the guys who are going to be draft eligible, as well as the guys who also are going to be projected, according to them, to go with decent draft capital here. And Mayer, you can see they have a top 10 pick capital on him. Mayer played at Notre Dame, 6'4", 265, big-bodied guy. If you watched any national Notre Dame game this year, you heard them call him Baby Gronk a lot. Honestly, way too much Baby Gronk references throughout the course of the NBC games. Michael Mayer, though, does look a lot like Gronk on tape. Guy who can get out in space, guy who can break some long plays, a guy who also does block pretty aggressively. And I think you're going to see these numbers start to bear that out. Shout out to the chat as well. Sup, Spags. How much better is this tight end class compared to this dusty wide receiver class? The more I watch the receivers, the more I'm just kind of blah on them. I do think the receivers are a little better, at least on the top end, than some of the other ones that, people have kind of spoken ill of. The slot receivers we talked about in that last video, the wide receivers overall, definitely slot heavy, smaller bodied guys with a lower draft capital, you would assume, because of the fact they're playing at small colleges. But this spot to me for tight end, I think these guys all look like outlier talents, whereas wide receiver, I kind of came in hoping to see what we saw last year with the Olaves, the Garrett Wilsons, all those guys, where they all looked, relatively spectacular. Wide receiver did not give me that same feeling. Tight end, though, I think these guys look great. And I also think it's possible with what we see in the playoffs, with what Travis Kelce's doing in the playoffs, obviously setting records again for multiple years in a row. But still, tight end to me is a position that I think offenses could prioritize a little more. Projections have 3 tight ends potentially going in the first round, but it starts with Michael Mayer. Shout out to Dustin as well. Switch it off the Swole Cast to join me to hear about rookie tight ends. That is the commitment here that I appreciate from all of you guys. But whether you're watching live or after the fact, I appreciate you guys just as much here because this is what the grind is. This is what knowing football, being ready for big board best ball drafts and all that stuff. This is what it looks like. It's starting to dig in now. Get your numbers ready, get your head right, and figure out where we're going and figuring out how you're going to rank these guys accordingly. Michael Mayer, though, let's talk about him. So you can see a lot of volume here, 24.5 routes per game, just shy of 9 targets per game. High target per route run rate, where he has been earning targets 36% of the time he's running a route. That stands out. A guy's ability to earn targets per route is definitely an important thing. Notre Dame's quality competition this year was kind of up and down, so I don't know that you want to give him the same cosign you might. Darnell Washington, a guy who ran less routes but was playing at Georgia, played all elite SEC teams. Michael Mayer didn't have that same kind of matchup repertoire, but he did put up pretty good numbers across the board. 5.6 catches per game, yards per out run, 2.8. So he's right there with pretty much all these tight ends, all these guys around that high 2s. I guess the one outlier would be Luke Musgrave, who we'll talk about from Oregon State. But nothing about Mayer here jumps out as like, I should be worried about this guy. I guess the one thing you can sort of nickel and dime him for a little bit, this intended air yards per attempt is pretty low for him. Certainly guys would be targeted closer to the line of scrimmage, but that's something where I don't think it matters that much relative to the NFL. It's Notre Dame football. Notre Dame not exactly known to be an explosive, high-caliber downfield offense. But Mayer, I think, did the best he could with the opportunities in front of him, grabbing a lot of targets. Certainly, if you were playing college football DFS, I have to assume the PPR points were there in spades. And he was also their best offensive weapon. So defenses were keying in on him. All that stuff looks pretty good. Avoided tackle rate here, 21%. Mayer's an absolute beast, Dustin says. I agree. I do think there are some tight ends where relative to draft capital, there might be better value later in the draft. But I think fantasy wise, to me, like last year, Daniel Bellinger, Trey McBride, the two guys that I talked about who are rookie tight ends that didn't have a ton of upside, that's how they were perceived in ADPs. Greg Dulcich maybe had a little bit more, but he was still going 20th round. These guys should probably be, 15th round at a minimum. I think for where the draft capital is going to go for Michael Mayer, if he does go top 10, Michael Mayer should probably be, a top 10 round tight end pick, I would think. But certainly a guy that's going to have the upside. The question to me is that I think a lot of these guys are going to have upside. And I think that sort of drags all the tight end pool down a little bit, where I think people will probably steam up Mayer, kind of the same thing as Bijan Robinson we talked about. Bijan is the best running back in the class. Michael Mayer is probably the best tight end in the class. But if the draft capital goes up so high, fantasy football players may draft that guy a little bit too high. And that's where there becomes a little bit more value going elsewhere. But besides that, though, Mayer to me looks unequivocally like the best tight end on the board, just relative to having volume, performing at volume, all that stuff. 0.138 EPA per target is actually a pretty bad mark relative to the rest of this class. But that's because all these other guys are such outliers. Mayer was out there playing a ton of snaps, looking pretty good. So to me, this seems like a spot where Mayer, don't dig him too much for the EPA per target numbers. As we talk about, sometimes that is a function of a team as much as it is a player himself. But, it does stand worth pointing out that he's not quite as good as Darnell Washington on the EPA front, not quite as good as Kincaid, not quite as good as Musgrave. Even Luke Schoonmaker, who's not like a highly projected tight end, but still a guy that was part of a Michigan team that was pretty good. He's got also better numbers. Like, that's where I think you could sort of say maybe Mayer isn't quite as good as advertised, but the fact that he can block, like I'm not looking at blocking stats here. He's a complete tight end. So I think that's where you can feel pretty good about Mayer. And you could also, I guess, perhaps say that Drew Pine can only throw about 7 yards accurately. I think that's also a thing to note here for Michael Mayer as well. Running out wide, he was not very good. So that's where I kind of view Michael Mayer as a true inside the tackles kind of tight end, inside the hash marks tight end, a negative 0.139 EPA running out wide. He was a little bit better running out of the slot, but again, you want to see these numbers be better. An inline tight end just has less value in the modern NFL than a guy who can split out wide and can at least run out of the slot. Travis Kelce's best games this year have come with him really running a lot out of the slot and being good on that. So that's something to keep in note, and keep in mind with how these tight ends project down the future, where teams are going to use these guys more like Travis Kelce's. They're going to use these guys more like Kyle Pitts. It's not going to be straight inline blocking. That said, Mayer is good at doing that traditional thing, and hopefully he can get better at some of those kind of traditional or those non-traditional wide receiver approaches that tight ends have these days. You can see under 10 yards, under 10 air yards. He's been targeted a good amount there, 6.6 targets under 10 air yards per game. Negative EPA on those throws, which, as we talked about, it's not surprising to see negative EPAs on throws that are closer under 10 yards because it's just harder to create the value above expectation when that happens. That said, it would be nice to see an elite tight end getting that much volume, have some explosive plays that break out from there. So I'm going to ding him a little bit for having the negative EPA here. It's all relative, but I think, again, when we're talking about a deep tight end class, that's where Michael Mayer, I think, gets a little bit more overvalued than he probably should be, because all these guys are going to look really good, and some of them have outlier stats in all these categories. Mayer does not have outlier stats in every single category. 10 to 20 air yards, though, he was a beast. So when he's getting past the first down marker, he was really good. 0.775 EPA per target, you can see on the screen there. 1.8 targets between 10 and 20 air yards per game, so decent volume as well. Was able to get downfield, that wasn't spectacular at it, a 0.628 EPA. Point being, he's good at everything. These are all positive numbers besides the ones that the throws are going to be close to the line of scrimmage. That's nothing that's alarming there. That said, though, like, he's positive everywhere. He has the pedigree. He has the blocking skills. He has all that ability. So, like, you start to look at the overall picture. It makes sense why Michael Mayer is the top projected tight end. But that said, like, I think there are some better guys that I would take who might be like an end of the first round pick, who might be a second round pick in terms of the NFL draft capital. So that's where I think Mayer, you could start to knock him down a little bit. But he's the tight end number one. Like, that's sort of where it is. I just think it's that if he's going where elite tight ends go, that's where you go, no, thank you. I'm not going to take Michael Mayer. I'll take Dalton Kincaid. I think Kincaid might be a better pass catcher overall compared to Michael Mayer. That might be a little bit of a hot take, but we'll look at the numbers and you can make the judgment for yourself. That said, though, with Mayer, I think, it's just clear cut. He's been the guy who's been locked to the spot. It's hard to expect him to not be the first tight end off the board. Not hard to expect him to not even be a top 10 pick. Like, at this point, I think with how the trade winds have gone and the draft rumors and all that stuff, this feels like somebody's going to go up and get Mayer and get the guy that they want. But I think Mayer's the tight end number one. For fantasy, though, maybe not. I think that's sort of how the best way to sum up Michael Mayer. Real life football, he's your tight end number one. I don't think he's Travis Kelce, though. So I'm going to say that right away. A guy that could be more of a Travis Kelce, though, I think you have to ask some questions. Maybe he's more of a Donald Parham type. Darnell Washington is a very, very large man. And that's something where watch the highlights of Darnell Washington. If you watch the national title game, if you watch Georgia at all throughout the year, you saw him out there doing some big things and just being a large human being. He kind of reminds you of the the guy who went viral and ended up being a terrible human being, Sean Oakman, where he was like towering over all the other guys on the field when he was out there. That's what Darnell Washington is. He's basketball player, like center sized almost, but he's a tight end. And he gets out there and he runs. Only ran 11 routes per game. So this is the kind of volume stuff you can start to ask questions about. But he was so effective on his 11 routes per game that it's sort of hard to ignore. Like you look at these numbers here, 11 routes per game, 3 targets. Compare that to Michael Mayer, who ran a little bit more than double the routes and had a little bit more than double the targets. But it's not like it's that big of a difference. So you have a guy who's 6'7", 270. I think the question is more like, does he become a Zion Williamson type? Obviously, different sport. But a guy where the concern was like, is he going to get really ballooned up and be too big to play the position? That's what I would worry about, where he's 6'7", 270 a muscle now. But I could say as a father of a 1-year-old, boy, that metabolism just really hits the shitter pretty fast. So I would say for him, he's not going to be not in his mid-30s when he's drafted, but he is still a guy that is going to be in the pros, going to be around some good food, going to be around some good eating, all that stuff. That's where you worry a little bit that he can get too big. If he maintains this size, though, he's basically a bigger pro wrestler size Vernon Davis, and I think that's pretty appealing. Look at the numbers. Didn't earn targets quite as well. Certainly a guy that I think is, it's not enough routes. It's not enough routes to feel like there's a negative to ding him on for that front. But a 27% target per route run rate's not that good. Same thing for the 1.9 catches per game. Like those are not that good. But it's not his fault. There's another tight end there who was being used enough. I think that's sort of where you can kind of give Darnell Washington a little bit of coverage. But overall, the numbers besides that look great. It's just the volume isn't there enough. Can he do that for 30 routes a game? Can he do that for 50 routes a game? I'm not that confident in that. And that's where the Parham stuff kind of comes to mind for me, where maybe he's just a big bodied guy and he's just large. Like Parham is big, but skinny. Washington is big, but broad and muscular. And like, is that going to hold up over the course of time? I'm not sure about that. But boy, he does kind of create a big target that has some appeal and at least fits the narrative of what you'd like a tight end to be. Next, Jelani Woods. That's an interesting comp there. Probably with the draft capital, have an easier pathway to getting on the field earlier than Jelani Woods did. But I think based on how you've seen Jelani Woods play in the NFL, I could see that comp being actually a pretty good one. And the hope is that Darnell Washington will be an elevated Jelani Woods with more size. But Jelani Woods, another big body guy who can make some plays in space and also can run after the catch pretty well. I think that's what Washington's going to bring to the table too. The rest of the numbers here, 16.2 yards per catch, 7.6 yards after the catch. Really good numbers. We talked about the yak numbers. Avoided tackle rate could stand to be a little bit higher, especially for a big-bodied guy who's not going to have the same advantage in the NFL, where he's just going to face bigger linebackers, obviously, especially, but also bigger safeties, bigger corners. Like everything's bigger in the NFL. Everything's bigger in Texas as well. We know both those things. But an 18% avoided tackle rate, like that's going to go down in the pros. So you got to worry about this big guy who can't miss tackles. It's kind of getting hit over and over again. Derrick Henry has made a career out of it. Can a tight end do that? Who's also big and going to get chopped the knees quite a bit? I'm not so sure. But numerically, there's just nothing here that stands out besides the avoided tackle rate as being not that great. Like his EPA per target, 0.4 EPA per target is a great number. He's also decent running out wide too. Not getting a ton of targets there, but a 0.4 EPA running out wide. When he's playing out of the slot, he's got a 0.524 EPA. So he's able to move around the field, not just an inline tight end. Like we talked about with Michael Mayer being a little bit more of a concern. Short throws under 10 air yards. He's got a positive EPA there. So talked about with Michael Mayer. Michael Mayer did not have a positive EPA. Granted, teams were probably not game planning for Darnell Washington quite as much, but still like a positive EPA on short throws. That means that he was pretty hard to bring down like you would hope he would be. So at least he's living up to the hype there, not playing small. Will Levis, a different position, but a guy who is gigantic as a QB, but also doesn't avoid tackles that well. That worries you when you see a big guy who can't avoid tackles because you're just going to absorb more blows. For Darnell Washington, like the ability to kind of get some positive production in close space, I think screams the ability that he might be able to absorb those blows and also be able to create some value out of it. 10 to 20 air yards looking pretty good as well. 0.5 EPA there, so not quite as good as Mayer, but still a very strong number. EPA per target on deep throws looking pretty good, a 0.638 EPA. That's all good there. On the red zone, he's actually not as good as Michael Mayer, which would surprise you because, again, this is a really big dude. Like, he should be able to bust anybody in the red zone, in the end zone, goal line plays. Like, that should be Darnell Washington. They didn't quite use him that way in Georgia, so I don't know if it's a fault of his or if it's a fault of how Georgia actually deployed this guy who's a behemoth. Like, I really can't underscore how big 6'7", 270 is for a tight end. But they just didn't use him enough in the red zone to feel great about it. Did okay with his 0.1 targets inside the 5-yard line. Should be an okay jump ball guy, you would think. Should be a guy who could also just kind of box out, again, like a basketball player would. So I think these are all positive things for Washington. I would say to me, though, I don't think he's the tight end too. Like, I think there's enough concerns with the size, the ability to stay healthy at that size, all of that, where I would go a different direction. But quality competition's there. The ability to produce in small volume is there. All the things look pretty good for him enough where you can make the case that he could be a tight end too. Mayer's going to be tight end one. I just find it hard to believe either of these guys can jump him. But I think a guy I actually like more than Washington, and this might be a little bit of bias too, as we talked about. The only college games I watch like every single week are USC games. So I certainly saw firsthand Dalton Kincaid stick it to us enough times. Utah as a team stick it to USC enough times. Dalton Kincaid is my favorite tight end in the draft. And I'll say that right now. Watch the tape of him. He looks really stellar, but also his ability to do a ton of things like Dalton Schultz is a player who's a free agent this year, and he's a guy that produced really well for the Cowboys. That said, like in terms of EPA numbers, in terms of what he was doing with the actual targets, he wasn't adding a lot of value. He just was kind of a body who was getting that role in the Cowboys offense. Dalton Kincaid, if you give him Dalton Schultz's workload, and I don't mean to compare, I don't mean to be racist against Daltons and just tie them all in together. If you compare Dalton Kincaid to Dalton Schultz, Andy Dalton, boy, those guys are all paired together. But no, like Dalton Kincaid, you give him Dalton Schultz's workload, I think he's really creating value downfield in a major way. I think he's better than Dalton Schultz will be at a much smaller cap hit. So that's where, to me, I think Dalton Kincaid is a guy, if you want to use Schultz as that sort of Mendoza line, the middle barrier guy, the replacement level tight end who could do well if you feed him the ball with a good QB or a decent QB, and then can maybe not do well if you put him in a different situation. I would let Dalton Schultz go, and I would take Dalton Kincaid because he's a stellar player here. 8 targets per game, 27.5 routes per game, earning targets per route run at a rate as good as anybody in this draft. Obviously behind Michael Mayer, but he had some more weapons around him in Utah. And Cam Rising, also a decently mobile QB, so you probably took a little bit of that away from Kincaid. But overall, these numbers just look great across the board. 0.371 EPA overall per target, 29% avoided tackle rate. The one worry I would have Kincaid is you watch the highlights of him, jumping over a lot of guys, like really hurdling far too many guys. But that said, he was making plays after that catch every single time you watch, even just like the all 22s. I did stumble on a few of those because honestly, I was really intrigued by Dalton Kincaid watching him. But he's a guy that is just good in every situation. I find it hard to find a flaw in his game. Maybe the blocking could be a little bit more of a problem for him. He doesn't seem like an aggressive blocker, but we don't care about that for fantasy. Like obviously blocking can get these guys on the field a little bit faster, but I just want guys who can beat Greg Dulcich, who can get out there, immediately get a role and be treated like they're valuable. The draft capital is the main thing for that. But I think Dalton Kincaid, if you saw him go in the second round or definitely in the first round, Kincaid is going to be a key part of that offense because I don't think they're going to have him in camp and they're going to be impressed right away and wanted to draw up plays for him, going to want to try to force their way to get the ball to him. Kincaid is that kind of player. So if we're going to say, I tweeted it, teased it in the tweet rather, who's going to be the Travis Kelce? Dalton Kincaid, if there is a Travis Kelce, I think Dalton Kincaid is the Travis Kelce. I think you can move him around the field. We'll look at some more of these numbers here. Justin saying Kincaid and Musgrave seem very similar to me. I think that's a good take, actually, because I like Musgrave a lot. And that's where I think that's where the Mayer stuff gets tricky for me, where I don't think Mayer is worth a top 10 pick. If you can get Kincaid in the 20s, if you can get Musgrave in the second round, like those guys are electric pass catchers. And there's no flaws to Kincaid's game. So I personally, if I were somebody rooting for a team drafting in the back half of the first round, I wouldn't want them to trade it for Mayer. I'd want them to stay right there and get Kincaid. That's the kind of player he is. That's the kind of interest I have in him. Let me highlight his row again. All right, so going out wide here. Positive EPA going out wide. Not quite as good as Darnell Washington, but that's fine. Darnell Washington, again, a very large man. And Kincaid played real teams as well. Playing in the Pac-12, I think a little bit of a ding compared to the SEC, but it's not like he's playing like Trey McBride. Trey McBride played for Colorado State, didn't play anybody of note. For Kincaid, he actually played some real teams, looked good, and it ran out wide, did well. Out of the slot, though, is the key thing. And again, this is where Travis Kelce derives a lot of his value as a pass catcher, running out of the slot. 0.646 EPA running out of the slot for this guy and at good volume. So you can't, we can knock down Darnell Washington for not running a ton of routes out of the slot. Kincaid is getting 4.5 slot targets per game and looking stellar with them. That's a crazy EPA for a guy who's a tight end who's just running out of the slot where, the slots kind of can be compressed as well and can drive down that EPA because of the fact you're just not getting the ball deep downfield because there's a lot of tacklers around. That's sort of how it goes. But if you can create high EPA out of the slot and you're a tight end and you can move outside and also you're a beast under 10 yards, look at this EPA number here. I know it's hard for some people to get excited about EPA numbers at the same way I do. A 0.396 EPA for targets under 10 air yards, that is a crazy mark for a guy because it basically means that I'm trying to think of the best way to sum up EPA, but like we've talked about enough about EPA on these streams, but the concept would be that, normally in a 1st and 10, a player is going to get 4 yards basically. So like that's going to be the case a lot of the times when you're targeting close to that line of scrimmage, when you're targeting out of the slot. But Kincaid's able to get downfield a lot more. He's able to kind of spread the ball around a little bit with where he's going with his routes. That means that there's a lot of upside for him in an NFL offense. So I like that a lot. The negative EPA, pass the sticks, I don't really know what to make of that, to be honest, because everything else here lines up with a player who should be able to catch passes everywhere on the field and add value to them. But a negative 0.103 EPA, 10 to 20 air yards, I don't want to freak out about that because everything else looks good, but it does seem like a noteworthy aberration. Maybe, I don't know, not quite as fast, unable to get to that spot as quickly as some other guys. I'm not sure what it would mean for Kincaid, but I think that's the one thing you can sort of poke holes in here. Because the avoided tackle rate's there, the ability to create value with plays is there, the ability to get some red zone work, we'll see if that's there. But overall, like Kincaid, to me, I just don't get why this number would be negative and so negative at that. But maybe it's the offense. There's a lot of reasons that I think you can kind of cover up for Kincaid and say that's not his fault. Which is what apparently I'm already blaming myself for Dalton Kincaid's misdeeds. But yeah, basically, I think for Kincaid, like I'm willing to cover up his lies because I think that's how good everything else looks. Not great in the red zone, so that's another ding there. I guess this is where you could sort of nickel and dime him, is that he's not, it's hard with the volume because volume is always so difficult, where 1.3 red zone targets per game, we're basically saying he got 10 red zone targets over the course of a season. Did he run bad with those 10 targets? I'm not sure. Is he going to run better with his 10 NFL targets in the red zone? Probably. So I think that's something where it does stand out that it's a negative number. But that said, I can't criticize him that much because everything else looks so good. Kincaid, a good catch and runner. Maybe this is where the Kelce analogy falls apart, because obviously Travis Kelce this year has been a red zone beast. Like he's getting 3 red zone targets per game, more than anybody else in the Chiefs. Like that all makes sense. So if you want to knock Kincaid, that's the one spot you can knock him. But I think it's just more like give him the opportunity, let him go, let him get out there. Kincaid is my guy. And I think also just the guy that if he goes into a wide open passing offense, Kincaid can have 100 receiving yard days. Kincaid can have 50-yard plays. He's got speed. He's got burst. He's got the avoided tackle rate. Again, 29% avoided tackle rate, second best in the class. Everything looks good for Kincaid. So I'm planting my flag right now. Team Dalton Kincaid, lock it down. Tight end 1. No, not tight end 1. Don't draft him in the first round, please, for the love of God. Can Kincaid actually complete a pitch back? If so, Kincaid over Kelce. I suppose that is true. If he can complete the genius Andy Reid plays, that's something too where I do wonder if the Chiefs might take a tight end with decent draft capital this year, because it does feel like you can get I don't want to like spoil this here, but you can see Sam LaPorta's numbers here. Guy who went to Iowa. Iowa's been a bit of a tight end academy over the years. Certainly George Kittle, the most famous ones, but there have been a couple other pretty decent ones from Iowa over the course of the years. LaPorta's a guy you can get for cheap. Schoonmaker is a guy you can get for cheap. Musgrave you can get in the second round. I do wonder if maybe a Kincaid or one of these guys ends up being the Travis Kelce understudy. Hard to say the Chiefs can get there in terms of draft capital and their other roster needs and all that stuff. But I do think there's a chance here that you could see a Kincaid or a Musgrave land somewhere that's a really favorable offense. And if so, then you can kind of really lock in Kincaid for a lot of production. And that's where I think Kincaid has the most upside. If he goes to a really slog it out team, like if Kincaid goes to the Falcons and he's the number 2 to Kyle Pitts, then no, Kincaid is not going to be that guy. Luke Musgrave, though, as Justin was saying, Musgrave does look pretty similar to Kincaid in terms of the numbers. 31% target per route run rate, 24 routes per game. So he did it with good volume. 5.5 catches per game, higher catch rate than some of these guys. That's a positive too. But, with QB play being what it is, I wouldn't hold that against him if it were a little bit lower. And he's also getting targeted downfield, 11.7 intended air yards per target. So that's a pretty good number for Luke Musgrave, getting downfield, getting targets, and also creating value with them. He did not avoid tackles, though. I don't even know how it's possible to have a 0.0% avoided tackle rate, but that's what he had relative to the SIS numbers. So Luke Musgrave, I don't get it. I don't get how he could be that bad for a guy who wasn't creating a ton of value yards after the catch, but I guess that would be it, was that he wasn't avoiding tackles. He was getting into space. So that's the one thing you can sort of hold against Musgrave, is that this offense for him really put him in position to succeed. Then when he met the point of contact, he didn't do much with it. So that's where Musgrave, I think, is a little bit of a failing and might be more of an offense guy than the player himself. But still, the numbers are so good, it's hard to ignore. Shout out to Lunchable Connoisseur. Shout out to the chat as well. Appreciate all you guys hanging out with me. I know talking tight ends never the sexiest thing, but honestly, these guys filled me with joy. So hopefully they'll fill you guys with joy if you grab them in a best ball draft. .605 EPA per target for Musgrave is actually the best mark out of this class. Again, I think that is a little bit more of where he's getting targeted just shy of 12 air yards down the field. So he's going to theoretically be creating more value just from the jump there, where if he's getting the ball targeted further downfield, that means he's going to basically be able to catch and fall down and create more value than another tight end who might be just as good, but getting targeted 5 yards away. So that's where Musgrave, I think, the EPA a little bit inflated, but still he was able to do it with that role. So you would hope that maybe an NFL team would see the college tape and go, hey, this guy was able to get past the sticks and get targeted frequently and still be good with it. So I think that's where Musgrave maybe could fit a scheme and they could kind of force the way to what Oregon State did for him. But definitely a player that it feels like the offense drove a good amount of his value, even though he came through with it. His EPA running out wide was not good, so that is not where I'd want him to be. Negative .55 EPA running out wide didn't happen a lot, just 0.5 targets per game, but still not a place I would expect him to add value. If he does, that's a bonus, but it's not a thing coming in where you have the hope that he's going to be a guy who could be your wide receiver right away. His slot targets, excuse me, 0.19 EPA and running out of the slot. So he fits that same thesis, again, closer to Michael Mayer than he is to Darnell Washington and Dalton Kincaid, but still a guy for Musgrave where I feel like he looks pretty good overall. Running out of the slot, the ability to do multiple things. That's the main thing we're looking for here. He's being used out wide, he's being used out of the slot, so you can move him around. Those are all things that I think will port over well to the NFL. Moving down the chart here, did not get targeted much under 10 yards. So again, he was getting targeted deep a lot. He was not being used like a traditional tight end, would be the main thing you could say from these numbers, where he's not a safety valve for the QB, he was more of a top target downfield. So that's kind of an interesting thing where he could be good underneath. He might not be. We don't really know why. The logic was that they just didn't have him running those underneath routes, but not enough volume to show up in SIS's data. And that's with 200 tight ends. So presumably just not getting a lot of targets close to that line of scrimmage. Going downfield, though, 0.572 EPA looks pretty good. Going downfield, 10 to 20 air yards. And this is where he really excelled. This is an absolutely batshit number, to be clear. So a 2.04 EPA. And you guys, if you follow the draft videos, you've seen there are not a lot of times you see EPAs even above 1. Here he is creating 2.04 extra estimated points added per target. So he is doing that each time he's targeted 20 air yards down the field. So he's basically a receiver at tight end in that one capacity. Is it the offense? Is it just that Oregon State was forcing the ball downfield? Was it Oregon State running their offense basically like I would play in Madden, where it's like, yeah, fuck it, I'm just going to sit back and I'm going to throw bombs? Like, that's what it is. That certainly can be the case here with that high average depth of target and all that stuff. But this is amazing value to be created, even as a small sample size. So I think, to me, putting a flag for Musgrave just because of the upside, or Musgrave because of the upside rather, and the fact that he can get downfield, that is a unique trait at tight end, and one that even if Kincaid is good, like, he's not shown it numerically to the same level that a guy like Musgrave was. So in this spot, to me, I keep saying the names differently. There's a Joe Musgrave, there's a Casey Musgrave, and there's a Luke Musgrave now. So I'll get it right one of these days. Point being, though, Musgrave, I think, is a really good value. He and Kincaid, I think, would be the guys where you see your real life team draft them. You get really excited about it. I think you see him in fantasy if they're going in the 18th round when the big board opens or whatever. I would absolutely take flyers on these guys. And I took flyers on Daniel Bellinger and Trey McBride too. They weren't great plays, but they did actually make lineups some weeks. I think that Musgrave, Kincaid, like, these guys can make lineups, I don't know, 4 out of 16, 4 out of 17 times. Like, I think that's probably a reasonable rate for them. Maybe a little bit more if they really land in the right spot. So Kincaid and Musgrave are two guys right away that I would say, like, if they get drafted anywhere in those top 3 rounds, take them in your best ball drafts, take them in your fantasy football, season-long redraft league drafts, dynasty, take them anywhere, because these guys are actually very live, I think, to be producing right away. And just the pass catching skills are absolutely going to be there from the jump. Luke Schoonmaker, another guy that people will recognize the name of, playing at Michigan, probably with not how I'm pronouncing it. I'm sure it's pronounced differently. That said, earning a lot of targets per route run, not running a ton of routes per game. But, if you assume that he's going to go into an NFL offense that is going to force the tight end to catch more passes and be more involved, that's where I think Schoonmaker does look a little bit better. So I think this is a nice spot for him to get drafted theoretically. Again, assuming he's probably second, third round guy, maybe third, fourth, I guess, at the worst case scenario. But these numbers look good. 0.441 EPA per target overall. Doesn't avoid tackles, but I think Kincaid and Mayer and Washington set the bar so high. Your tight end shouldn't be avoiding that many tackles normally. Like, these guys really are not supposed to be that elusive. Like, they're supposed to be, maybe they avoid a tackle by just running over a guy here and there. But Mayer and Kincaid and Washington are the outliers here. A guy like Schoonmaker is just kind of an average guy. Like, he's just going to bull you over. He's going to fall down when he catches the ball. But that's fine at tight end because you really just want him to be a part of an offense where he can get the target workload, can get 5 to 6 per game, and then catch and fall down. That's where Musgrave, I think, or Schoonmaker, excuse me, is going to look pretty good. Again, it's all offense dependent, all where these guys get drafted. But I think for him especially, it's like, you can't expect him to create value above what he's going to get in front of him. He's not avoiding tackles. He's not getting downfield. But whatever you do put in front of him, whatever you give him those targets, you give him 6 targets a game, 10 air yards per target, he's probably going to capitalize on those 10 targets, or those 6 targets rather. So that's where I think a guy like Schoonmaker makes sense. But again, it's all subject to the offense. If he goes somewhere shitty, if he goes to the Titans, it's like, great, you're not Okonkwo. You're not going to be that guy. If he goes to the Bills and he's like a Dawson Knox potential replacement or something, like that's where Schoonmaker, I think, starts to look good. So I don't always mean to use the Bills as that offense analogy, but I think Schoonmaker is really going to be offense dependent if he goes somewhere that's going to use him and not just use him as like an inline blocker. Schoonmaker, also pretty good running out of the slot, 0.424 EPA, not a lot of volume there, so it's nothing I would try to flag too heavily. Very good at short range targets, again, because he doesn't have to actually beat anybody, doesn't have to do much. Just kind of has to catch and fall down. 0.392 EPA when targeted under 10 air yards, that looks pretty good. When being targeted past the sticks, this is a stellar number for a guy being targeted past the sticks, 0.85 EPA. So he looks good, just a classic kind of catch and fall down tight end, which I have no objection to. So I would certainly prefer Kincaid, would certainly prefer Musgrave, but Schoonmaker, I think, is like right there too as a guy that can be viable in the right offense, better than Daniel Bellinger. I think, played better competition than Trey McBride. So I think he's a guy that should be in the mix too, as a guy that would make sense for fantasy, as a guy that could actually change an NFL offense positively. So that's something that I think with Schoonmaker that I feel pretty good about too. Whyle's my favorite light around tight end. Surprised how bad some of those numbers look. That's why I like to look at the numbers and try to get a read on them, because I do think when you have the eyeball test, you sometimes fall in love with these guys. And that's why, I look at the numbers first and I look at the highlights after, and I kind of try to identify how that stuff lines up. But yeah, I would say for me, like Whyle, I don't see much numerically there. We'll talk about him in a second. But like Sam LaPorta, I think is legitimately a potential steal here. So that's a guy that I would say I would highlight a lot more than Whyle, but you got to challenge your sort of opinions with the numbers. I think is always what I try to do with them. And if they can inform something that you already believe, great. If they don't, then, be willing to be challenged by it. And I think that's where tight ends, especially, like, it's a really thin margin of success for tight ends unless you're getting drafted in the first round. And I think that's where a guy like Whyle could go either way. If he lands on the right offense and he gets the run, great. He'd also be a Jeremy Ruckert type who actually came in with an okay pedigree, just didn't get used in year 1. Maybe he gets used in year 2. You don't know. There's a lot of guys like that who kind of fit that criteria. So it all depends on the landing spot. Is there a pathway for Whyle to get on the field? Then you can like him again. But I would say relative to the college numbers, like not standing out that meaningfully. Cameron Latu played at Bama, so that's always a thing you give a little bit of an upgrade for, because he played real competition, as we talked about with Bryce Young and also Jahmyr Gibbs. For Latu, though, really not anything I'm seeing that's that great here. Not avoiding tackles really well. Had probably an inflated touchdown rate per catch just because of the fact this offense is still a Bama offense, and one that was running decently well, even if not as well as it was during the better days of Bama when they were actually winning everything year after year. But Latu, I mean, honestly, he was one of those guys that, to me, I don't really get why he's going so much higher than some of these other guys, other than when you say like, oh, he played real competition. He played some guys that are going to be actually, in the NFL, in the SEC. Like, that's where I think Latu sort of gets kind of drummed up a little bit more. But looking at his numbers here, like, he's good running out wide, but didn't get a lot of volume there. He's not great running out of the slot, got more volume there. Okay, getting targeted close to the line. Pretty good getting targeted past the line of scrimmage, but nothing here stands out. Like, he's kind of a middle of the pack guy across everything. Those are the guys that worry me the most coming into the NFL, where you don't have one elite skill. You don't have anything that stands out. And it just ends up being something where it's entirely down to the dice roll. Then where do you land? How much opportunity do you get in practice? How many reps do you get? All that stuff. That's where a guy like Latu can start to make some headway and perhaps be a guy who learned the fundamentals better playing at Bama, playing against real competition, having to block and do all that stuff. But just the raw metrics here, like good in the red zone, okay at the line of scrimmage. Nothing stands out volume-wise. He didn't earn a ton of targets per route run. 16% target per route run rate would actually scare me off quite a bit of Latu. I just think that you can kind of talk yourself into small sample size guys. Like Washington's a small sample size guy, but he was getting 27% targets per route run rate. Whereas you look at Latu, he's getting a ton of routes and just wasn't getting targeted. That worries me a little bit, because Bryce Young was a guy that I think would have taken advantage of Latu being open. So to me, Latu feels like a guy that'll get drafted pretty decently because he went to Bama, because he's going to be a big-bodied guy who we know will come in with some core competencies. For us as fantasy players, though, he's probably more of a Bellinger or maybe even below. So that's where Latu, I think, would go for me. Just not a guy that stands out meaningfully enough to want to justify like touting him and getting heavily into him. And then, if he lands the right spot, then he's probably going to be CJ Uzoma. And like, what does that do for you, really? Maybe gets you one spike week here and there. All these guys are so far alive for sure to at least make an average rookie tight end impact, regardless of landing spot. I agree. I think, honestly, to me, Latu is that line where these guys start to fall off a little bit. Like, just look at the above Latu here. Like, all of these guys, I think, can go into a bunch of different spots and be effective. And certainly can do well and also create value even in adverse conditions. Whereas, like, you get to Latu down, I think there starts to be some question marks. Like Davis Allen here, I just don't even get why he's on this board. He played at Clemson. The college pedigree thing, I think, is a tough one to unpack sometimes, where for the NFL, they want guys who played real competition. They want guys coming in. And we as fantasy players, like, we want that too. Like, you want guys who are not going to be Zach Wilson and get completely stunned by the bright lights immediately, or even Christian Watson, where there's like a really big ramp up period for him to kind of learn the routes and learn the competition and all that stuff, and then still be kind of inconsistent from there. A lot of these guys, though, relative to NFL draft capital, they just get drafted because the NFL teams know they're going to come in and be effective enough. And I think that's where Davis Allen would go for me, where, yeah, he's a positive EPA player, so he's not killing you, but like, he's not earning targets at a high rate. He's not missing tackles at a high rate. If he's a great blocker, then sure, that's probably a positive for him. But all these numbers down the board here, like, he's okay running out wide. He's okay running out of the slot. He's okay running under 10 yards or getting targeted under 10 air yards. He's okay getting targeted 10 to 20 air yards. He's okay getting targeted downfield. I don't want a guy who's just okay, because then sort of the decision tree comes away from me and it goes towards everything that we can't control as fantasy players. So that's why you want these superior players in great spots kind of thing. Like, that's what you want to draft. And I think for me, looking at Latu, looking at Davis Allen here, like, these guys just don't stand out as anything besides guys who played at an okay college and were okay. And that could be enough to make it in the NFL. It could not be enough to make it in the NFL, but to give these guys viable careers. And I think that's something where, Latu, Allen, two guys to me that pop up a lot in the middle part of these drafts and these mock drafts. I just don't see it. I just don't see them being like outlier players like some of the early tight ends are. Tucker Kraft, don't have stats for him because he played at South Dakota State, which is what happens when you play at a small school. And then we also probably would nickel and dime for playing at a small school anyway. So Tucker Kraft is one of those guys I would watch out for draft reports. If he gets steamed up a lot, if the hype around him starts to get to a certain level, then, and he gets drafted highly, like the Christian Watson comp is the best one. If a guy sort of follows the trajectory, gets overdrafted, then you could go, hey, the team is going to be invested in this guy getting there. And maybe you could talk yourself into a guy who gets drafted later by the same team, the Christian Watson versus Romeo Doubs thing. But I think for a Tucker Kraft, it's like, if he gets drafted somehow right after Kincaid, then I'll go, shit, he must be really good. If he gets drafted in the 5th, 6th round or something like that, it's like Tucker Kraft is probably just the guy. If he lands in the right spot, you could take him sometimes, but have no faith in it. That's what I would say for any of these guys who don't have any stats and also are coming from a little school. It's just a matter of like where they get drafted, if a team falls in love with them and wants to invest in their growth. And for Tucker Kraft, I haven't seen enough positive juice about him to feel like he's worth going out of my way to learn more about. Sam LaPorta, though, I think it's kind of a beast. I don't know what's wrong with Sam LaPorta. The EPA numbers you can see per target, not that great, but he played in an Iowa offense that really wasn't that good, so I don't want to hold it against him. But a 33% avoided tackle rate at tight end, 33% target per out run rate. I also don't want to just like blow past the avoided tackle rate thing. This is what Anthony Richardson has as a QB, and he is going to be an elite rusher at QB if he's not an elite thrower. This is a crazy number to see from a tight end and a guy who's 6'4", 250, so like not huge, kind of Greg Dulcich size, maybe a little bit bigger, but still a guy that I think can create some value by himself. So I don't want to hold the negative EPA against him too much because he's playing in a shitty offense. So yeah, they didn't score a ton of touchdowns. They didn't create a lot of value. It's not a surprise. The fact that he's able to get the ball downfield and avoid tackles and also get targets, earn targets at a 33% share, that makes LaPorta interesting. So out of all these kind of late round tight end guys, I think LaPorta stands out to me, relative to draft capital where he's going to go. He shouldn't get drafted ahead of Kincaid, shouldn't get drafted ahead of Musgrave, shouldn't get drafted ahead of Schoonmaker even. But I do think I would draft him ahead of Latu. I would draft him ahead of Allen. I'd probably draft him ahead of Tucker Kraft. I think Sam LaPorta to me looks really good in terms of the core metrics here. Other numbers to note, he can run out wide, but was a negative EPA player. Again, it's sort of tough because this Iowa wasn't good enough for me to feel like, oh, this is all Sam LaPorta's fault. That's why he's got a negative EPA number here. You look through their numbers, they didn't do a whole lot of note across any position. Is he more like Fant coming out of Iowa is a good question. I guess Fant's another yard after catch guy. If you had a Noah Fant caliber career from Sam LaPorta and he goes in the 5th, 6th round, I feel like you'd feel pretty good about Sam LaPorta. So the Noah Fant comp might be good. And then the ceiling, if we just want to solely lock him into Iowa tight ends, maybe the floor / middle outcome is going to be him being Noah Fant. And then the ceiling outcome is him being George Kittle. Will he be George Kittle? I don't know. I hope he's buddying up to George Kittle and going to tight end camp and whatever shit that those guys do. But Sam LaPorta, to me, I think is a guy that played in a bad offense, but the core metrics here look really good. Just negative EPAs across the board. It's a crappy team. Like, I don't know. You got to give him some kind of grace for playing on a crappy team. But his numbers, the stuff that he could control, that avoided tackle rate, the ability to earn targets, he did control those about as well as he could. So Sam LaPorta, to me, is one of those rare late round guys that it might not matter where he lands. He still might be able to create enough value to give himself some upside. The rest of these guys, Josh Whyle, I know Justin was asking about positive EPA, so he does have that over Sam LaPorta, but Cincinnati was a little more of a high octane offense. So I guess you could sort of make that case right away that he should be able to create more points because the offense was better. His other numbers for Whyle here, not bad running out wide. I mean, he's positive EPAs across the board. So positive EPA running out wide, positive EPA running out of the slot, positive EPA getting targeted in short range. So that's a positive for Whyle as well. Honestly, not bad. He's not a great deep ball guy. Like, this is a really bad number for a deep ball EPA, just because of the fact that inherently the act of throwing a deep ball creates more value. So the fact that he's got a negative number there means he must have been really bad with the limited targets he was getting there. Besides that, though, I guess out of the dumpster guys, Whyle looks okay. I certainly prefer LaPorta, but I could see why Justin likes Whyle. And yeah, great minds think alike. Brenton Strange is the last guy I'm going to highlight here because I do think there was some merits to him. And this is a little one for me where I talked about with Justin, like, hey, Josh Whyle, you watch the tape and you look at the numbers and it's like, oh, maybe they don't line up quite as well. I do think Brenton Strange is another one of those guys where the numbers don't line up quite as well for Brenton Strange, but boy, he looks good on tape and he looks pretty solid, big bodied guy, though apparently not as big as the other tight ends. Just a gigantic tight end class is worth noting too. 19% targets per route run, not running a lot of routes per game, 15 per game. It does have 7.6 yards after the catch per catch. That's a good number. 22% avoided tackle rate. That's a good number. Brenton Strange also can run out wide. Wasn't bad at it, but didn't get a ton of volume there. Really good out of the slot, though, in a limited sample size. 1.2 slot targets per game and a 0.9 EPA, which is the best in the class. So that's the kind of thing for a tight end where it's a lot easier to put him in the slot and expect him to have passing upside. That's where Brenton Strange, I think, does stand out a little bit. Getting targeted close to the line of scrimmage, he was really good, a 0.409 EPA. Then he wasn't really targeted a meaningful amount, enough to make a sample size here, 10 to 20 air yards. But then downfield, another guy with a +2 EPA, it's +2.521 EPA, in fact, for Brenton Strange. So when he was getting downfield, he actually did create some value. Was also really good in the red zone, really good in the end zone. Small sample size stuff. Again, I'll keep pointing that out, which the tough part, sort of compartmentally these guys appropriately. But I think that Strange is a really nice play here. Chip saying the same thing. Strange is the best sleeper tight end. With where he's getting drafted, according to the CBS mock here, 214th overall. I don't get it, especially as a junior, so he's a little bit younger too. I don't really understand why Brenton Strange would be this low. I would put him, again, if we're going to use Latu as a line, I'd put Brenton Strange ahead of Latu. I'd put Brenton Strange ahead of Davis Allen. Like, I think he's better than all those guys. So if I'm going to give my rankings here, and then I guess we could talk about the team fits and all that stuff, I think it's still Mayer 1 for me. I would go Kincaid. I would go, man, the size thing with Washington freaks me out. I think Washington's the most overvalued tight end just because he played at Georgia and just because people see the freak size and all that stuff. But I worry about that being able to hold up in the NFL. So for me personally, I would say it's Mayer, Kincaid, Musgrave, Washington, Schoonmaker. Then I would go LaPorta. Then I would go Strange, and then the rest of the guys can all just kind of go wherever they go. But that's how I'm feeling about the rankings here. In terms of team fits, Michael Mayer, who's a team that needs a good blocker, but also a guy who can have some volume at tight end. The irony is, like, he would be a really good fit in Arizona, except that they have Trey McBride, and you got to think they're going to be locked into trying to grow him a little bit more. But Mayer's a better version of Trey McBride, so I'd like to see that. Let me see who's got a top 10 pick, because it's basically got to be a top 10 pick. Let's go here. Oh, I hate the autoplay videos. Get out of here, autoplay. All right. So we got the Bears. Bears have Kmet. Mayer would be an upgrade for Justin Fields. If the Bears trade back and they get Mayer, that'd be a pretty nice haul. I think the one thing that we talked about with Houston a couple weeks ago, and I talked about it with Pete too, where like Houston could theoretically find their way to get 3, 4 first rounders in there. If I were them, I would pick one QB, I would pick one receiver, and I would pick one tight end because I think these are all really good positions to go there. And I think that's something that that stands out to me. So I would love to see Mayer on Houston, but I think they too can just get a late first round, second round tight end and get that Kincaid, get that Musgrave and feel just as good about it. But I think that's where I would prefer to see Mayer go somewhere where he's going to really get used and be a focal point of that offense. If you had, let's say, Mayer and Jackson Smith and Jigba out there, like that's a really potent over the middle combo where you then just need that outside game breaking receiver. And I think that's where if I were on a team that's like the Texans and looking to restock the entire shelves, I think getting Mayer paired with another high draft capital receiver in this class, one of the guys we actually like, I think will be a really nice pick for them. So I would say going to Houston. Waller replacement. Interesting. I mean, there's going to be a lot of replacement tight ends out there. It's sort of hard to pinpoint where the tight ends are going to be this year because like Ingram's a free agent. He can go somewhere big. Like the Bengals might be a team that tries to target Ingram if they can figure out how to make that money work. So I don't really feel the most comfortable projecting the spots, but Vegas is going to need a tight end. Yes. The Patriots might need a tight end because both their guys are free agents. There's a lot of ways that I think tight ends can go pretty highly here. And I think these guys all deserve the draft capital. But looking at Zach Kuntz of Old Dominion, let's see if we can put him in. I didn't look into him because he wasn't on the top prospects list. But if he's on these lists, he will come up. All right, there he goes. There's Zach Kuntz, negative EPA guy. Actually, he would have the worst EPA out of this class, so that would immediately give me a little bit of a spooking. Not a great avoided tackle rate. Earning targets, about average, so that's fine. Oh, he got hurt this past year. Okay. Yeah, nothing standing out, but if he got hurt, then he probably played a few less games. So it could be a little bit of a small sample size thing here. Okay, pass the sticks. Yeah, nothing stands out with Kuntz meaningfully. And again, the lack of competition playing at ODU, like I'd probably give him a downgrade there too. If a guy plays at an ODU, if a guy plays at a South Dakota State, I think you want to see them be absolute world beaters and be absolute monsters. Because if they can't be an absolute monster playing against lesser competition, how are they going to do that against the NFL guys? Like at least for a Cameron Latu, you could say like, oh, you played at SEC. I'm gonna have to say Chips chat here. My brain doesn't think that's how you say his last name. Yes, I know the classy way to say it is going to be Kuntz. Perhaps you could say it a more guttural way, but no, the baseball player, the famous baseball player Rusty Kuntz, was spelled that same way. So I'm gonna assume it's Kuntz and not the the version I don't want to say to get canceled once again here. Oh, he's 6'8". See, 6'8", though, is too big. Like, I think that's where, like, I talked about Washington enough. That's where I just worry about the size. Like a 6'8" guy, you're just getting clipped in the knee time and time again. And it doesn't feel like a big difference to me or you. Like if a guy's 6'4", like he's still 3 inches taller than me. The guy's 6'8", he's still 7 inches. I'm still looking up at them either way. It doesn't fucking matter. But point being, like, I think for an NFL caliber player, a guy who's going against NFL caliber defenses, you don't want a guy who's too big because it just gives him a bigger area to hit and also potentially hurt you. So again, a guy who underperformed with that elite size playing at ODU, who then is coming into the NFL and going to get chipped and get fucking crushed in the kneecaps time and time again. Like the Zach Kuntzes of the world would be guys that I would probably try to avoid more than not. But you know, that's me sort of talking about it out of my ass. So Justin, it seems like you follow tight ends pretty closely. You might know more than I do about that stuff. But I just think from my perspective and what I know from, you know, these conversations, talking to people who know their stuff, Football Outsiders and in general, like the pedigree is going to matter the most. And then just dominating at whatever level you are is going to matter the most. And when we talk about guys dominating, it's Mayer, it's Washington, it's Kincaid, it's Musgrave, and it's LaPorta. Those are the guys that dominated. So if you're just going to make a list of 5 tight ends, like those are the 5 tight ends there. I just think, you know, I would kind of put in Schoonmaker with that. And I would put in, you know, maybe Brenton Strange with that too. But that's me, you know, it's kind of trying to figure out how this works. There we go. There's a tight end. So next week, I'll be coming back. I think I'm actually going to have my Spags rankings, which encapsulate all the NFL players as well as the rookies here. I should go full screen for myself for this part. So that's something I haven't figured out how I'm going to distribute it, but I am putting the rankings together, looking at underdog ADPs, going to pull in some core stats as well, but I will be putting together my official rankings, which I'm going to use for myself when doing the big board drafts coming out this week on Underdog. If you want to get ready for best ball season, now is as good a time as any to use that promo code SPLASH at Underdog. They'll double your deposit up to $100. So get in on that right now. Play along with me here. I will be drafting teams all summer long, all spring long, all winter long. The addiction to drafting doesn't stop here, guys. So get in on it. And please make sure to subscribe, like the video, leave a comment down below, follow me at Chris Spags, follow the show at Splash Play Pod. I will always grind to give you guys the best info that I will actually be using myself across fantasy football, across betting, across all that stuff. And that is my promise to you if you are part of the Splash Play community. But appreciate all you guys for hanging out with me again. Come back next week for sure. I might do one more stream this week to do some big game drafts. And I don't think I'm going to do a showdown video because I don't have the effort in my heart. But check out yesterday's stream with Pete. That was a great one we did too, covering everything, covering the prop bets, covering the DraftKings, covering the underdog drafts out there. So check that out. And I'll be back with you guys again very soon. So enjoy your weeks. Go tight ends and good luck. Bye.